Okay, good morning, everyone. This morning, we are here to take a look at an amendment that, as I understand it, may or may not be offered on S-127, but it relates to shelters and zoning as it relates to the development of shelters. So this was something that Representative Donahue wanted to make sure that we took a look at, and other members, because the shelters falls within our jurisdiction. And I don't know exactly where this is going to end up, but we'll at least get an overview of what the current language is. And there's been a few versions of this. So Ellen, welcome to House Human Services. Thank you so much for being here. And we'll do just a brief run around because it's your first time this year, at least in our committee. So I'm Teresa Wood from Waterbury, and I also, also represent Bolton, Score, and Huntington.
I'm Ray Garofano. I live in Essex and I also represent Essex Junction.
Hi, Jubilee McDonald from Bridgeport, and I'll be also representing Middlebury, Newhaven, and Bakeridge.
Morning. My name is Zon Eastis. I live in Guilford. I also serve Vernon.
Good morning, Todd Nielsen. I represent Brandon Scarsdale.
Doug Bishop. I represent Colchester's Chittenden 20 District.
Brenda Steady, East Milton, Westford.
Good morning, Dan Noyes, represent Belvedere, Johnson, Hyde Park, and Wolf.
Great. And Representative Cole. Sorry, we're just introducing ourselves, so why don't we just made the way around.
Well, luckily we had time on our way in this way. Yes, right from Hartford.
Great. Thank you. And we would love it if you would review this part of the amendment with us, or proposed amendment. Thank you.
Sure. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. So yes, this is, I think, my first time ever in this room.
Yeah.
And that's because I generally handle land use and energy and climate change. So I'm here under my land use umbrella for municipal zoning. And so I do believe you have the amendment posted today under my name, draft 4.1, dated May 14th at 3:13 p.m.
That's the one we've got. Yes.
Okay. So, so 2 years ago, the legislature amended 4413, which is part of Title 24. Let me step back. 24 VSA Chapter 117 is the municipal zoning chapter that establishes what towns are allowed to do in their zoning. So towns, there's regional planning, then there's town planning, and then based on a town's plan, a town may adopt zoning to regulate land use within the town. About half of towns have done that, so it is not every town. But if a town has adopted zoning, it needs to comply with the requirements in Chapter 117 for what is in their zoning. Zoning gives towns pretty broad authority about what they can regulate under their zoning, but Section 4413 establishes a list of things they have less authority on. So subsection A in 4413 is a very specific part of this statute, but the rest of 4413 lists things that towns are not allowed to regulate in zoning, including farming and electric energy generation. So the farming and energy are regulated under other statutes. So 4413 says they're not allowed to regulate them under zoning. 4413A is a slightly different provision. It's sort of a middle ground provision that says the following land uses can only be regulated with respect to location, size, height, building bulk, yards, courts, setbacks, density of buildings, off-street parking, loading facilities, traffic, noise, lighting, landscape, and screening requirements, and only to the extent that they do not interfere with the intended functional use. So under zoning generally, towns have authority to regulate broad types of aspects of a project, including the physical things like are listed in the statute, as well as other things, and they have the authority to attach conditions. But 4413A is establishing a smaller subset of things that towns are only allowed to regulate with response for these uses. So for the uses listed, they can only regulate the size, height, building bulk, etc. So they have a lighter touch in what they're allowed to dictate. And this is a pretty old statute. Subsections A through E are have been in statute for a long time, and they're sort of community uses. So state and community owned and operated institutions and facilities, schools, churches and other places of worship, public and private hospitals, and then waste management, solid waste management facilities and hazardous waste management facilities. So towns are only allowed to regulate certain aspects of these types of uses. And then 2 years ago, the legislature amended this list and added emergency shelters. Emergency shelters here, I think you all are actually very familiar with what I'm talking about here. Not to be confused with shelters during an emergency, like a FEMA shelter. So these are the emergency shelters that you all have been spending more time working on, and the housing and homeless context. There is a definition that was added along with this, in case you're curious. It's actually in 4303. And so the definition of emergency shelter is any facility with the primary purpose of which is to provide temporary shelter for the homeless in general, or the specific population of the homeless that does not require occupants to sign leases or occupancy agreements.
Can I ask a question, Ellen?
Yes.
So that, it says temporary, but it doesn't say any duration.
Right.
Okay. The reason I'm thinking about all of this is because we have a pending bill,
Right.
91. There is kind of a distinction between an emergency shelter and then a shelter that might be used for longer term support. Like, generally, I mean, right now, folks are staying up to a year or so before, in some instances, before they find more permanent housing. I think in this room, we're distinguishing between emergency, which would be really short-term in nature. It could be like a cold weather shelter. It could be something that's set up for intake only, so people might stay there only 1 or 2 days. And then the longer-term shelter. And it doesn't sound like that definition distinguishes.
No, it does not.
Okay, so it would be all inclusive.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so there isn't this amendment does not consider any changes to that existing definition. What it is proposing to do is 2 years ago, you added emergency shelters to this list, which gave municipalities limited authority over regulating emergency shelters in the town. And so the proposal is to strike it from this list, but add additional language, basically making its own category. And so that's on page 2. So subsection, also 2 years ago, you did add this language in subsection 3, which is about hours of operation. And so for purposes of this subsection, regulating the daily or seasonal hours of operation for an emergency shelter shall constitute interfering with the intended functional use. And so you've created this as additional special criteria for emergency shelters in this context, that the towns also can't regulate the hours of operation if it interferes with the functional use. And so that was a new change 2 years ago. And so this new language then on subdivision 4 is modifying this. So bylaws shall identify at least one district where an emergency shelter may be regulated only with respect to the aspects listed in subdivision 1 and subdivision 3 of this subsection. Within other districts, the municipality may regulate all other aspects of an emergency shelter. So this is creating sort of a new regulation scheme just for emergency shelters. It has the municipality identifying at least one district where the emergency shelter shall have this limited set of review criteria. And then in other districts within the municipality can review other criteria for the project, like operational aspects. So that's one distinction, is under A1, it really is looking at physical aspects of the site, the setbacks, the location on the property, the building bulk, traffic, but not other like operational aspects that zoning also sometimes looks at, like requiring personnel or hours of operation. And so in one district, there will be limited oversight by the municipality and its zoning. In other zoning districts, the town will have more authority to regulate aspects of the shelter.
Representative Nielsen.
How large does the town have to be under this law? Does this apply to all towns and villages?
Any town that has adopted zoning for their town. So it does range from all the way up to Burlington down to the smallest towns, as long as they have adopted a zoning program for their town.
Okay, thank you.
So when I look at A1, these are the things that it says that municipalities can regulate. What are the things that are not included on this list? I mean, it seems pretty comprehensive to me, but I don't know, we don't do zoning here, so I don't know what is not included.
Yes. I think generally, towns have pretty broad authorities that they can attach conditions on when looking at zoning. And so one of the examples I can give you is there is a case related to this, an older case, where there was a challenge to whether a town could be applying this statute to a state garage. And so one of the things that was at issue was the town attempting to regulate that the state operating the garage would be required to meet all labor and industry standards and requirements. And so even though the state probably would have complied with labor and industry standards, they argue that the town does not actually get to dictate the labor practices in their garage. And so that is something that has been common sometimes for towns to want to try to impose. So things about how the business is actually operated by the person applying for the permit. So yeah, like I think there's like operational aspects of the business. I think hours of operation is another example, even though it's a little confusing here because you've already specifically applied for that. But previously, before 2 years ago, towns often would try to limit or dictate what the hours of operation for a shelter would be, whether it be seasonal or only a night shelter. So that would be something they would have more ability to do in these other districts, is to control those types of aspects.
So something just popped into my head in regards to shelters. So could, for example, one of those limiting things be that the let's say disability or health condition of the people who are homeless. So could a town say, under the proposed language, that, okay, here we're following everything that's up in A1, but in these other places, no, we don't want people who have mental health challenges here, or no, we don't want people with physical disabilities there, or whatever the case might be. Those are those potential limiting things that towns could zone in?
I think so, with the caveat that that area of law is not something I'm super familiar with. So I don't know if there's any overarching, discrimination that,
Right.
Towns do have to abide by other like state and federal laws. You have to comply with, they can't, the ADA provisions and things. So I don't know. I would say yes, but as long as they're not violating other laws.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not, to be fair, I'm not at all clear about whether or not those types of things would be violating, like ADA. Americans with Disabilities Act. That seems like a challenge.
So if I understand, so there could, in a town, there would need to be two districts in order to make what we're differentiating here come to pass.
Mhm.
Some, I suppose in a very small town, there might be one zoning district. Yeah.
I don't know that any town has one zoning district.
Okay, so I don't know.
So
that.
what we're typically talking about with zoning districts is residential, commercial, industrial, and some towns have rural or agricultural districts where they dictate which uses are preferred and which uses may need may need a permit or may not need a permit. And so obviously towns do range in size, but I don't think any of them just have one district.
So then, following then I guess I don't really understand why this is needed. Just not quite getting it.
So currently, obviously the proponent of the amendment has an opinion, but
Yeah, well, I'm not saying I don't see.
We don't hear from Representative.
I just don't understand, yeah.
The big picture distinction of what's happening is that currently towns can only issue a permit addressing size, parking, traffic, noise, setbacks. And so under this new change in the law, they would have one district where that's all they could do. And in other districts, they could apply more criteria and potentially be more limiting.
So they could zone out.
So,
They could zone out
Yeah.
certain
I was
shelters.
trying to figure out where the,
Yeah, although
What's the potential
we usually
for
say
harm?
zone out means out of the whole town. This is providing, they have to have at least one district, and then in the other districts, they can be more restrictive.
Yeah. Which
Right now, they can't be that restrictive.
they can't be without restrictive at all.
Well, I mean, they can restrict the things that are in A above.
Yes, yes.
Correct. So, I think that some of the background of this is that in some cases, there were organizations that were having difficulty locating shelters. And the change in the law actually permitted shelters to move forward in relatively quick order after this law was passed. And so to me, I look at this and I say this further limits shelter development, which is sort of like the opposite of what we're trying to do in our committee.
So it feels like to me, but I can't quite, yeah.
So we'll hear from the proposer of the amendment in terms of what her community is looking for.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Ellen in terms of like what the language is saying?
This is actually pretty complicated, deep level of zoning, and
Yeah.
so I hope I've explained it clearly, but this is like niche zoning. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it because actually I think you made it understandable.
Yeah.
So appreciate that. Any other questions about what's actually sort of written here and is potentially being proposed? Okay, thank you, Ellen. Representative Logan.
That's answered everything. I need, please.
Good. Oh, I have one more question. It's actually related to Representative Nielsen's question. So if a town doesn't have zoning, what happens?
Then a shelter wouldn't need a permit, and so.
Wouldn't need a permit at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Logan, welcome.
Hi, Representative Kate Logan from the Chittenden 16 District in Burlington. Thanks so much for taking a look at this amendment. Yeah, I was in the Committee of Jurisdiction that passed this original amendment in the Home Act 2 years ago, and pushed really hard for it because of the issues that some towns were having with allowing a shelter to be developed, and that did it did require those municipalities to find a place where they could allow these, what in one case was a low barrier shelter and the other two cases were not low barrier shelters, because those towns were just unwilling to zone for emergency shelters at all. Or well, they had zoning for emergency shelters, but they subjected those to really significant conditional use review that ended up effectively meaning that they would not zone for shelters. So that was successful. especially in places where there was a challenge getting any shelters whatsoever. I represent Burlington. We're in a different situation. We already have 8 shelters. We have a couple low barrier shelters. Up until we passed this law, we allowed emergency shelter wasn't allowed use in like almost the entirety of the municipality under conditional use review. And so every shelter that has opened in Burlington up to now has gone through this conditional use review process and been granted a permit. I don't think I've asked the planning department and other city councilors, and to their knowledge, there's never been a shelter project that was not allowed to be developed that sought a permit. But the issue that we're facing, this is primarily centers around low barrier shelters. So we have several residential districts in Burlington. We have high density, mixed residential commercial, transit corridor, and low and moderate density residential. The concern of the city, the majority of the city councilors in Burlington was that a shelter provider who wanted to open a low barrier shelter in a low density residential area would not have to undergo a significant conditional use review on shelter operations in that low density residential zone. So you could imagine they'd still have to comply by other zoning regulations and like density regulations in the municipality because that's allowed. So they couldn't pack, say, 100 people into a small structure in a low density residential zone. But there could be no regulation of that shelter. They couldn't say, for example, that they don't want to have a low barrier shelter on a block that includes an elementary school. So that's what it really comes down to, is low barrier shelter. They expressed concern that given the high need for low barrier shelter right now, if a shelter provider had access to a structure in one of these low density residential zones, they might seek to develop there. And the city council would like to have more say in the operations of that low barrier shelter. For example, if, like one of the examples provided was that what if they wanted to put a low barrier shelter up in the far new north end of Burlington where there's no access to day services, but then they close during the day because they didn't have adequate staffing to stay open all day, then you'd have a group of people living in a low barrier shelter who then have to walk half a mile to get to a bus and then drive and then take the bus all the way to downtown Burlington to get to the day station that's operated by cops there. So it was that kind of thing. There were other comments made that I just won't put on the record, but you can imagine that there were concerns related to low barrier shelters and what the optimal locations for low barrier shelters would be. They didn't ask that we create a whole separate set of zoning regulations for low barrier shelters, but that would be one option. Basically, this amendment just seeks to say that as long as you have some districts, at least one district within your municipality, in Burlington's case, it would be 3 districts within the municipality where there are limitations on what the town can regulate the shelter on in terms of its development, then in all the other districts, they're allowed to allow emergency shelters as a use, but subject the project to a higher level of development review, and have more to say about shelter operations. So that's what Burlington's looking to do.
Thank you, Representative Logan. I have a couple of questions and then we'll move. So you talked about zoning location. That is something that is actually the first thing that says that towns
Can.
municipalities can regulate with respect to location.
Location just means Ellen can speak to that a little bit more. This is one of the things that we've spent the entire session discussing, which is why I think we're getting to the last weeks of the session and saying, okay, we actually do need an amendment, and have been really trying to figure out the right language. So what the municipality can do is say, okay, emergency shelters are on this list, so we're going to put them only in this location, a zone in the town. It doesn't mean that, as far as I understand it, because of these they can't say, for example, okay, low barrier shelters can't go by an elementary school. Or they can say, so if they're going to say that they don't want low barrier shelters in a low density residential area, they kind of have to include all emergency shelters, because we don't make a distinction between types of emergency shelters in the definition. That is not included here. It's earlier on in the.
Okay, and then my second question is, you just referenced things like hours of operation. That's one of the things that's not changing in this. So they couldn't regulate hours of operation.
It does actually. So if you take a look at on the page 2,
Yeah,
line 6 and 7, bylaws shall identify at least one district where an emergency shelter may be regulated only with respect to the aspects listed in subdivisions 1 and 3. So
it's
in
three,
those zones,
3 the thing that is just above
yeah,
it.
3 is just above it.
And so it says it cannot.
So that's right, in those zones where they are under those regulations for subdivisions 1 and 3, which is that.
Right, I get that.
Yeah. Then in other districts, the municipality may regulate all aspects of an emergency shelter.
So then my last question, and I'll let other people, is there was previous versions of this that kept in G, emergency shelters, and then made provision for exception.
Yeah, then it just excluded, I mean, they all accomplished essentially the same thing. They just did it in different ways by putting it in different sections.
Okay, Representative Bishop.
Couple of thoughts. And so what was the thought process about not being specific to low barrier shelters, if that seems to be
Well,
what's at the heart of the desire of the Burlington City Council to have greater regulatory authority over it?
Because there were other things that they mentioned. I actually can't think of anything right now because the focus was primarily around low barrier shelters.
I guess I ask because it seems like this maybe creates a loophole. For at the moment, you said there are 8 shelters currently operating in Burlington, which to me generally speaks of a community that's receptive to working, address the homeless problem, crisis. For a moment, let's assume that the city was not receptive to supporting homeless members of the community. They could create this singular district out past the Ethan Allen homestead, someplace, that's not, let's assume for the moment they could do that, but whatever. They could put it way out there, or in your example, way out, even further on the north end, that wouldn't really be accessible to services, but they could create that as the one district and then make it so complicated in the other districts because they have complete ability to regulate that they could effectively eliminate shelters in Burlington.
Right. Yeah, they could do that.
That's extreme example,
Well,
but
so
I'm just trying to keep it in the Burlington.
So let me tell you what the impact of this policy change has been, is that that is exactly what's happening, is that because we require municipalities to provide zoning for emergency shelter, we don't tell them that they have to provide it everywhere. We say they have to provide a location for emergency shelters in their zoning, but we can only regulate emergency shelters with respect to this list in subsection A1. That's what's happening is most municipalities are finding some little postage stamp zone where they're saying, okay, like South Burlington, for example, We'll allow emergency shelters in Colchester. We'll allow emergency shelters right here and then nowhere else. They're not allowed in any other zones. So that is what's happened in towns surrounding Burlington, for example. Burlington has already restricted zoning, rezoned, eliminated emergency shelter as an allowed use from low and moderate density residential zones, and has restricted emergency shelter zoning to a tiny little area downtown Burlington. One other residential zone, I can't remember which it is, and then a tiny strip of transit line, like so right on a bus line.
So help me understand. I'm just having a hard time getting through some of
I
the
know,
language.
yeah, I get it.
So for communities that may be reluctant, you referenced Colchester and South Burlington.
Yeah.
This to me seems like that could reinforce those practices, not.
They're already allowed to do it. They're already allowed to pick some, and that's what they have in fact done.
Yeah.
So they've picked one place where they're allowing emergency shelter zoning because we didn't tell them where they needed to put it. We just said you have to put it, you have to allow it somewhere. So in that case, say there was a shelter operator who wanted to open a shelter in Colchester where there currently is no emergency shelter. And Colchester has picked this zoning district to be where emergency shelter is going to go, but it's not like actually a great location for emergency shelter. It's not even where the shelter provider wants to put the shelter. I think that they would have grounds for a lawsuit against the city of Colchester to say that the fact that they have zoned for that district, which is useless for the purposes of emergency shelter, is in effect not allowing zoning for emergency shelter, and I think they'd win the lawsuit. So that's one example from like a non-Burlington context. The argument from the City Council of Burlington is that they have rezoned to restrict zoning to these three districts, which I personally may not agree with, but it is how it is. And so this amendment the city council would respond to this amendment by rezoning again and allowing emergency shelters as a conditional use in the low and moderate density residential zones. And in fact, there is a family shelter project that is seeking development right now that would be in a moderate density residential zone. And if we don't make this change, then they will not rezone and that project will not be allowed to move forward and would have to be relocated in downtown Burlington.
Representative McGuire.
Thank you so much. So this amendment would remove local control and put it up to the state control, where the state could dictate down to local control.
No, it's the opposite. What we did, removed local control in at least one zoning district in that municipality. They have to abide by state law. They can only regulate the shelter on this list of things in subsection 1. And so we took municipal control away for emergency shelters because what we saw was municipalities were refusing to permit emergency shelter projects anywhere within their municipality.
Well, I just want to be clear that we didn't take it away. We said that it's limited to these areas.
Right, we restricted.
Right.
We put limitations on municipal bylaws, which is the name of this section of the chapter. And so what this does, the amendment does, with this one phrase, within other districts, the municipality may regulate all aspects of an emergency shelter, is it says that as long as you have one district where you have these limitations in place, then you can exercise control over the permitting process for the shelter. So that would mean that in your development review board, there would have to be a hearing on the emergency shelter. And the members of the development review board might say like, well, this shelter's miles away from the day station. I think we need to require that you are open 24 hours a day, and they'd be able to do that.
And would they be able to require, for instance, the staffing ratio?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
All aspects. Yeah,
Right.
okay, so Representative Steady, and then that's going to be the final question because we have other witnesses for our next topic. So go ahead, Representative Steady.
DRB, you mentioned DRB.
Yeah.
Like, I live in Milton, so DRB, let's say a shelter wants to go in a neighborhood. You have to notify all the people in that neighborhood so they can come to the DRB meeting. So let's say they want to put a shelter in a neighborhood. So they notify all the people in the neighborhood and there's 2 or 3 daycares, home daycares, let's say. And they come and they say, we're not comfortable. How do you think that would work?
I mean, hopefully the daycares would suggest things that would make them comfortable. But like, again, remember Milton would also need to provide a zoning district where a shelter project could move forward without having to hold that hearing. So that's what this means. The limitations on municipal bylaws, Milton has to have a district where a shelter provider can move forward with development of a project. And well, they could subject it to conditional use and there would be a development review board hearing. But in that case, if the child care providers came and said we're uncomfortable with it, but they don't use any of these things in subsection 1, location, size, height, building bulk, yards, et cetera, as the concerns that they have, then the municipality is not allowed to, disapprove the project on the basis of those kinds of concerns.
Location being one of those.
Thanks.
I mean, but municipalities do, what location means is that the municipality gets to choose where in the town emergency shelters are located, and they don't have to put them anywhere else. And that's what Burlington has decided to do because they don't like the limitations placed on them.
Okay, thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will be asked for our opinion about this amendment whatever form this language takes, and it may take the form of an amendment, it may take the form of a separate bill somehow. Could I see a show of hands of those people who are supportive of the amendment? Could I see a show of hands for people who are not supportive of the amendment? You need to say one or the other, Esme.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, I feel like I need more information, but.
That's why I'm voting
Yeah.
no, and, I think either way, whether we do something or we don't do something, there are obvious, complex things that need to be addressed, and I'm not sure if fiddling with the system right now is the best thing to do. I really want to see what happens with H91. I think it needs to be a longer conversation. And so I'm just not really feeling comfortable either way. About how it stands, and my complete understanding of it. So I'm hoping it's something we can dig into next year with, the, Environment Committee.
I think at the end of the day, the whole point of H91 in particular is like the integration of services with the location. And so I think, whatever we do, we want to make sure that there aren't loopholes that are, continuing to separate the two, and so that we're ending up in the same problem that we've been having for so long. So I totally agree, making sure that we aren't missing anything policy wise that lead to the isolation of some place over here, and then, yeah.
Can I make one comment?
Not right now.
Okay. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I need to.
Okay, so I'll say no for now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Representative Logan. Thank you, Ellen. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, so Head Start. Head Start, thank you so much. Sorry for being a bit delayed. We appreciate you being here this morning, and you're Christy, right?
I am.
Yes, I remember meeting you at the the celebration over at Capstone I guess it's been last year. So let's just do a quick round of introductions, since I don't think you were here when we were introducing ourselves. I'm Teresa Wood from Waterbury, and I also represent Bolton, Buellscore, and Huntington.
Good morning, I'm Dan Noyes. I represent Wolcott, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Belvedere.
Hi, good morning. Eric McGuire. I represent Rutland City.
Brenda Steady, East Milton, Westford.
Good morning. Doug Bishop, I represent Colchester's Chittenden 20 District.
Hi, Todd Nielsen, represent Brandon Forest, yeah.
Morning, my name is Zon Eastis. I live in Guilford and represent Vernon as well.
And I'm Esme, I represent Hartford.
I'm Julie McGowan. I represent Bridgeport, Middlebury, New Haven, Weybridge.
Hi, Christy Ray Garofano, Essex and Essex Junction.
I'm Lori, Worcester City Assistant. Okay, that's great, Katie, say hi. Katie, read in action circles. Okay.
Just ask me the passing.
I know she knows you, but not everybody knows you, Jessica. All right.
Ask me all kinds of good representatives.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being here today as well.
Thanks. I'm Christy Swenson. I'm the director of Capstone Head Start, and we serve families in Lamoille, Washington, and Orange counties. And I'm also the chair of the Vermont Head Start Association.
Thank you.
So I'm here just to, I guess, talk a little bit about how Head Start interacts with all of the other services that you hopefully know about in the Vermont early ed world. I think the way that we're integrated is not well known. What Head Start is we were put together to help children who are at risk of being behind when they start kindergarten in order for them to thrive and be ready for kindergarten when that time comes. So we serve prenatal through kindergarten. And what we do, a lot of folks are familiar with our high quality early childhood education, but that's one of three things that we do. We also really work on the whole child in regards to their health, welfare, those pieces. And a huge part of what we do is family stabilization.
Christy, can I ask you to step back just for a moment and describe who is eligible for Head Start services?
Sure. So folks that are eligible for Head Start, most people are familiar that you can be income eligible, which is 100% of the federal poverty guidelines, which is a quite extreme barrier. I'll say.
Very low.
We can have up to 30% of the kids we serve can be between the 100 and 135th percentile, of the poverty level. And then we can have 10% who can be over income, is what we call them. What folks often don't know is about categorical eligibility. So children are automatically eligible for Head Start if they're experiencing homelessness, if they're in foster care, if they have someone in the family who is receiving SSDI. So that's within the household. And also if they qualify for benefits, which has been pretty strictly interpreted to be TANF and SNAP. So those are the folks who qualify. I will say the way Head Start works is that it is a federal to local program. And so at the local level, we do an intensive community needs assessment every 5 years to determine what the needs of our community are. And that informs not only the structure of the services that we provide, but also who we prioritize to enroll. So we have a points system. So depending on where you live, like Rutland right now has quite a large homeless population that's experiencing homelessness. So they have prioritized that. And those kids get to the front of the line. They get to the front of the wait list. In my program, we're really seeing a lot of substance use disorder. And so that's something that we are prioritizing. So those kids get to the front of the line. So it's a little different everywhere. And that kind of rolls me into saying services that are provided are a little different everywhere for the same reason.
So you get to customize that you have sort of like the basic eligibility, and then within that, you are able to set priorities that are specific to your region or your community.
Correct.
Okay.
our service area. Yeah, sure. And then the services that we provide also are tailored to what we learned from our community needs assessment. So, for example, when we did our community needs assessment at Capstone a little over 5 years ago, what we really saw was the intense need for childcare slots for infants and toddlers. So we expanded that part of our program at the expense of some of the other services that we had offered in the past because we saw there was greater community need for that. And so I'll just also say, the services can look totally different depending on where you are. So it can be that traditional where we have a center that we're running. And so in my program, we have one of those in Barrie and one in Morrisville. But it also looks like partnerships where we work with local school districts to run a Head Start classroom in the elementary school. It also looks like us partnering with community childcare providers. And so we're going in and some of their children who are eligible for Head Start, we provide all those wraparound family stabilization, health, mental health services. And then we're also providing training, mentoring, coaching, monetary support for them to increase the quality of services. So, well, I'm going to get off on a tangent a little bit. So for both when we're working, partnering with elementary schools and when we're partnering with community childcare providers, what that means is that we're increasing the level of quality and the knowledge of the teaching professionals for the entire classroom, even though maybe 25 or 50% of them are Head Start enrolled. So that's something that I think is important to state is, yeah.
Go ahead, Representative Steady.
Go ahead. So if a middle-class family is struggling and they live paycheck to paycheck, but they don't get benefits, so their child wouldn't be eligible?
They would be eligible.
They would be. Good.
In fact, really every child is eligible, but we can only let in 10% for that over income, right? Because if they're not categorically eligible and they're not income eligible, then we put them in the over income category. And so if they are middle income, they aren't accessing any, a SNAP or TANF or anything. Right. However, somebody has a substance misuse disorder in the family. Somebody has a substantial disability. Maybe they're a military family. Some folks prioritize that. There could be ways that they get to the front of the wait list, even though they don't qualify based on any of the things that I've stated. However, we can only have 10% of our enrolled kids can be in that category.
Okay. Thank you.
You keep a wait list by category,
No, we keep a wait list by location. So like I have a wait list for our center in Barrie. Mm-hmm. We also have a wait list for home visiting in Barrie. Mm-hmm. Then we have a wait list for, whatever other service there might be. So sometimes folks will contact us looking for a slot and we can say, well, we don't have any openings at our Barrie City Center. However, we're partnering with this community preschool. Mm-hmm. And we have some slots there that we could get you into.
I see.
And
I'm presuming also when you talk about the schools and the community childcare and early learning centers, that you're also meeting parent-child centers as well?
Yes. So in some ways. So in the Northeast Kingdom and in Brattleboro, the entity that has the Head Start grant also has the parent-child center.
I see.
In other locations, we partner, a lot with those folks. We share clientele sometimes. A number of years ago, we partnered with one of our local PCCs, and it didn't work out. They did everything on there that they were expected to do. We did everything we were expected to, but there wasn't enough overlap in children that would qualify because they're serving low income, but not as low income as we are. And there just weren't enough children in their classrooms that we can make it work.
And So what's at risk at this point in time, in terms of, this is a pretty much, I mean, I know that programs are also eligible for childcare financial assistance participation, and you participate in that way. But, a good, obviously big chunk of your money is federally funded. And so I know that there have been rumors about Head Start being on the chopping block. What is your sense of what may happen at the federal level?
So I'm less angst than I was a month ago.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think that was the intent a month ago, was to eliminate Head Start altogether. There are a whole lot of Head Start families and Head Start graduates that spoke up to their legislators, and that was not shown in the skinny budget. When the president's skinny budget came out, it did not call for cuts. That's reassuring, but let's see what the full budget says, and let's see what Congress does with that. We're not out of the woods yet, I guess is what I would say. And so my anxiety around that is the way that Office of Head Start and Office of Child Care look at things is that when we're providing, say, in a child care facility in that model, the Office of Child Care funds, those child care subsidy funds, are meant to pay for basic service. And then the Office of Head Start, those Head Start funds layer on top to increase quality and provide all of those family stabilization pieces that we do. And so we need that layered cake, if you will, in order to do what is pretty intensive multi-generational work.
So what I'm hearing you say is that if there are cuts in the federal child care appropriations, that would impact Head Start, even though Head Start may or may not receive a cut. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Has that potential? Okay.
Correct.
So the services that you're providing are more comprehensive, let's just say, than I guess more traditional childcare support that's provided to families, for those families in need of those supports. Okay. All right. It's helpful to have an understanding of what any potential impacts may or may not be. And because I'm not sure that, we all understand the sort of integrated nature of Head Start with education, with our childcare programs, with, mental health supports for children in these services. So it's so while we think about Head Start as sort of something separate, it really is integrated and additive to the quality and improving the quality of childcare services in general, not just, I think you made that point about what you go in and provide in terms of assistance benefits everyone in the classroom, not only those students who are eligible for Head Start.
Exactly. And I would say also something that has, well, the part of it that keeps me up at night is, if Head Start services, our Head Start dollars were cut or reduced, is all of those intermingling pieces that I think folks on the ground know and nobody else does, which is all of those family stabilization pieces that we do. So like in my program, I have a full-time family services worker for every 35 kids. It's intensive work. If that were no longer funded and didn't exist anymore, other people would have to fill that gap. So for example, if there's a family that is involved with Child Protective Services is creating the goals for that family. It's the Head Start Family Services worker that is helping them achieve those goals and work to meet what they need. It's the same in Reach Up. It's the same, in WIC. We do, for Head Start enrolled families, we're doing those nutrition activities. and WIC counts them. So WIC doesn't have to provide those nutrition activities. So we're interlaced with the whole system, and without us there, I don't know what that looks like. It's like taking a string out of a sweater. Everything else is
Unravels,
impacted.
right, yeah. And in the document that you provided, you gave us that, you know, some sense of your impact in some of these other areas. Are there, excuse me, other, and when I look at this, I look and I say, okay, you know, in childcare, parent-child centers, you're providing 38 staff in parent-child centers, you know, at a cost of $2.2 million. What's the total amount coming into Vermont in Head Start?
Oh, it's, I'm gonna say it's 27.4 million. I can't remember exactly, but it's something along those lines.
Yeah. And what is the allocation based on? Is it based upon the rate of poverty in the state? What's it based on?
It's based on whatever was created 60 years ago, if I'm completely honest. We were way past. So for instance, my program serves those 3 counties. We've been there for 60 years. So 60 years ago, somebody applied for that grant and said, we'd like to serve these 3 counties, and the government awarded them X amount of dollars to do that. So over the course of the last 60 years, there have been opportunities where we have applied for expansion grants so that we could get more money to serve more children. But basically, we are the same. They tell us how much money we have and what our service area is, and we do our community needs and say, what's the most good we can do with that amount of money for this service area? So that's how it's determined.
And is there, are there cost of living increases? Are there, no, it's just.
We get cost of living increases at the whim of Congress.
Yeah.
So, you know, some years we get one and some years we don't. But generally it doesn't keep up with inflation.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Representative Bishop, and then Representative East. Blah, that was sorry. Representative Eastis after Representative Bishop.
Looking at, for example, the parent-child centers, 38 staff, is that, are many of those staff counted, is there in an embedded early childcare program that operates out of the parent-child center, or are they doing other functions within the parent-child center?
The majority of those are teaching staff in parent-child centers, where the parent-child center childcare is also a Head Start program. And they're paid with Head Start dollars.
So on that, following that question, can you describe a little bit then about, you're talking about how intermingled you are. So do other departments, for instance, inside the state, come to depend on your services as a budgetary item? Are you contracted by the state to offer these services?
There was a time before my time when DCF did contract for some slots. I don't know a whole lot about that. I've only been here 10 years and it's from before then. So they do not contract with us. I think to be honest with you, like that's part of my worry piece is I know the folks on the ground. If you talk to a DCF caseworker, they know the kind of work that Head Start is contributing. If you talk to the commissioner, I don't know if they do know.
So I guess thank you. So what I'm trying to understand is you're doing certain work that seems like it's also being overseen by certain departments here. And so they just don't have to budget for it then?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
So are you in communication with them as to help build their budgets?
Nope.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really begs the question, if something happened at the federal level and Head Start went away, you know, we can take a gander at what the potential impact of that would be across the system of early education and learning. Right. And it would be pretty dramatic. And it would, and the part that's not here, because is what you were just talking about, is departments like DCF and the health department, where Head Start programs serve the kids that are either, in the custody of DCF or at risk. And then kids eligible under WIC programs, for family services and nutrition counseling and things like that. That'd all be gone.
And so I presume also the information would all be gone then too. It might not be accessible because you're not connected in any real way that whether we know what's.
Not at high level. I mean, at the ground, our family services folks are at all those meetings about families and working hand in glove with all of the state folks, but we don't communicate much at a leadership level.
It's part of us getting educated about if something, that's part of why we're having this meeting, is because, we need to understand what the potential impact is if something were to happen to Head Start, the impact on childcare centers, on parent-child centers, on DCF, on the health department. I think people pretty much understand that the state of Vermont would not be able to replace everything that would be cut at the federal level, but it would be up to the full body of the legislature to decide where the priorities were for things that we would try to not totally replace probably, but at least try to address.
And so then for me, a real problem there is that without the knowledge, the high level understanding of relationships, we can guess what's going to get prioritized as we step forward.
Yeah.
Because we don't have the whole picture really. Yeah.
Which is part of it, about educating us so that we have a fuller picture.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and that's, Morgan Crossman asked me an interesting question a couple of weeks ago. She said, if you guys were funded at 50%, what would you keep?
Mm-hmm.
And my answer is, I would keep all of that family services work. I think that's where we're getting our long-term outcomes as far as high school graduation, college graduation, lack of incarceration. All of that stuff is coming from that family services work. And that's what's the most enmeshed with other things. And my fear is that I'm not sure that the state administration doesn't more value the childcare slots.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the least of what we do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. We've sort of started peppering you with questions.
That's fun.
Just want to make sure that you have an opportunity to, add anything that you were intending to say.
Well, I don't think there are a couple of service options that I don't think I talked about yet, which is we do home visiting. Some programs, again, my program does home visiting. In the Northeast Kingdom, they do home visiting. Brattleboro doesn't do home visiting because they don't have a need for that. But in my service area, because we have a number of families that are so rural and so not connected to the community in much of any way, that's really a vital service that we supply. And so what that looks like is we go out once a week for an hour and a half. And in theory, 45 minutes of that hour and a half is spent teaching the parent how to support their child's development. So letting them know what developmental norms are, helping them work toward whatever is the next step for their child. And that does not look like us on the floor with the child doing an activity and telling the parent what we're doing. That looks like the parent on the floor with the child and us coaching them so that then we leave those materials until the next week and they can carry over those activities. The other 45 minutes is that family stabilization. So making sure they maintain their housing, helping them access post-secondary ed if that's something they're interested in, working on whatever is needed to stabilize that family and move them forward.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about reach ahead and reach up, and the family plans there, it seems like, and honestly, when we've had folks in to talk about that, not just this year, but in previous years, they haven't ever really talked about the integration with Head Start. And I think it's really helpful to hear you talk about the role that Head Start has with those families, because they're, I'm sure, one of your target populations, and that the the resources that you bring to that, whether it's in training or coaching or staffing, is really important to those families, and their success in reaching their family plans. Thank you for enlightening us about that. I'm sure, I have members here who maybe were more familiar with that, but I think that it's important for us to be able to, when we hear about things like in Reach Up and Reach Ahead, to be asking about, okay, well, what's the connection, and how are you going to maintain that connection if there is a threat to that link, Any other questions that people have for Christy? Thank you for the work that you're doing with families. Let's keep our fingers crossed that, things stay put. All righty. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. And if you ever have an opportunity, and maybe we'll add this to our list of places to visit, but they're close by in Barrie. I've been there a couple of times, but it's a great place to see Head Start in action. If we could come on a field trip sometime.
Anytime.
That would be awesome.
But also, I'm sure, folks who are further afield, I'm sure your local programs would love to have you by as well.
Thank you, Christy. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Okay, folks, we'll have a brief break until 10:30, at which time we'll come back and